There is a number that appears repeatedly in personal finance literature and behavioral economics research, and in the quiet observations of people who have spent decades studying how wealth actually accumulates, and that number is $100,000. Not because it is a finish line, and not because reaching it guarantees anything meaningful about someone's financial future, but because something measurable and documentable tends to shift in the relationship between a person and their money once that threshold is crossed. The mechanics change, the options available change, and perhaps most importantly, the psychological architecture that governs financial decision-making begins to operate under different conditions than it did before. This is not a video about motivation, and it is not a video about shortcuts. What it is an attempt to examine with some precision what actually happens at the level of mathematics, behavioral psychology, and systemic access when a person moves from having very little capital to having a meaningful amount of it. The gap between $0 and $100,000 is not simply a large number. It is, in many documented ways, a structural gap, one that separates two fundamentally different experiences of how money behaves. To understand why that gap exists and what crossing it actually changes, we need to start not with motivation, but with mathematics. Consider two people. The first has $5,000 saved. The second has $100,000 saved. Both are disciplined. Both spend carefully. Both invest in the same index fund, returning a historical average of roughly 7% annually after inflation. At the end of 1 year, the first person has earned $350 in returns. The second person has earned $7,000. The behavior was identical. The outcome was not even close. This is the mathematical reality of compounding that is rarely discussed honestly, which is that compounding is not equally powerful at all levels of capital. At low capital levels, the absolute dollar return generated by investment is too small to meaningfully alter a person's financial position, which means the only lever available to them is labor income. They must earn more, save more, and spend less because the capital itself is not yet generating enough to matter. Economists and financial planners sometimes call this the accumulation phase, but what that term obscures is that during this phase, a person is essentially running a race using only one engine, while the mathematics of the system rewards those who can activate a second one. Charlie Munger, the late vice chairman of Berkshire Hathaway, made an observation that has been widely cited in financial literature, that the first $100,000 is the hardest money a person will ever accumulate, and that, once reached, the capital begins to do a portion of the work that previously only labor could do. What Munger is describing was not magic. He was describing a threshold at which the returns generated by capital become large enough in absolute dollar terms to begin functioning as a meaningful secondary income stream, one that operates regardless of how many hours are worked, regardless of what happens to a single employer, and regardless of short-term fluctuations in personal income. At $5,000 invested, a 7% annual return produces $350. That amount cannot meaningfully change a person's financial trajectory in a single year. At $100,000, that same 7% produces $7,000, which, depending on a person's cost of living, may represent 1 or 2 months of living expenses, a meaningful emergency cushion, or the seed capital for an additional investment. The number itself has not changed. The engine has. The mathematical shift, however, is only part of what changes at $100,000. Research in behavioral economics, particularly work emerging from studies on financial stress, cognitive load, and decision-making quality, suggests that the psychological experience of managing money changes significantly as a function of how much of it a person has. Sendil Mullainathan and Eldar Shafir, in their research on scarcity, published in the early 2010s, documented something that financial advisors had observed anecdotally for decades, that operating under conditions of financial scarcity, meaning insufficient resources relative to perceived need, tends to consume a disproportionate amount of cognitive bandwidth. The mind, when preoccupied with shortage, allocates attention toward the immediate problem at the expense of longer-term planning. This is not a character flaw. It is a measurable cognitive response to an environmental condition. What this means in practical terms is that a person managing a financial life with very little margin, where a single unexpected expense can destabilize an entire monthly budget, is operating under a kind of cognitive tax that a person with a meaningful capital buffer is not. The decisions made under that tax are not necessarily worse in intent, but they are made under conditions that reliably produce shorter time horizons, higher sensitivity to immediate costs, and reduced capacity for abstract financial planning. Mullinathon and Shafir described this as the bandwidth cost of scarcity, and their research demonstrated that it was not unique to any particular income level. It was a function of perceived resource adequacy relative to perceived need. When a person crosses the threshold of $100,000 in liquid or semi-liquid savings, something begins to shift in this cognitive architecture, not immediately and not uniformly, but the buffer itself begins to alter the conditions under which financial decisions are made. The emergency that previously would have required a high-interest loan or a credit card balance can now be absorbed. The unexpected expense that previously would have triggered a month of financial anxiety can now be handled from reserves. And as that buffer grows, the cognitive load associated with financial management begins gradually to decrease, which frees mental bandwidth for longer-term thinking, for opportunity recognition, and for the kind of patient decision-making that wealth accumulation tends to require. Beyond the mathematics and the psychology, there is a third dimension to what changes at higher capital levels, and this one is structural. The financial system, as it is currently constructed, does not offer the same set of options to all participants equally. Access to certain categories of investment, certain financial instruments, and certain institutional relationships is gated, sometimes explicitly and sometimes implicitly, by the amount of capital a person controls. The most explicit version of this in the United States is the Accredited Investor Standard, which requires a net worth of $1 million excluding a primary residence, or an annual income exceeding $200,000 before a person is permitted to participate in certain private investment vehicles. The regulatory intent behind this standard is investor protection, the assumption being that individuals with less capital are more vulnerable to loss. But the practical effect is that a large category of investment opportunities, including private equity, certain hedge fund structures, and early-stage private company investments, are legally unavailable to the majority of the population regardless of their financial sophistication. $100,000 does not cross the accredited investor threshold, but it does begin to open doors that are closed at lower capital levels. Certain brokerage relationships, certain bond market access points, and certain lending terms become available at higher asset levels. A person with $100,000 in a brokerage account is treated differently by financial institutions than a person with $5,000. Not always in ways that are formally stated, but in ways that are nonetheless real and consequential. The range of instruments available, the quality of advice offered, and the cost of financial services all shift as capital levels increase. This pattern of access expanding as capital grows is not a conspiracy or a deliberate design to exclude. It is, in large part, a structural reflection of how risk and transaction costs work at the institutional level. But its effect on individuals is real regardless of the mechanism that produces it, and it means that the financial experience of someone with minimal capital and someone with meaningful capital are not simply different by degree, they are different in kind.
This dynamic is not new. The structural relationship between capital access and capital accumulation has been visible throughout modern economic history, and examining it across different eras reveals that the threshold effect, the point at which capital begins to generate meaningfully different options and outcomes, has existed in various forms across very different economic contexts. In the decades following World War II, the United States experienced a period of broad middle-class wealth formation that was, by historical standards, unusual in its reach. Government programs, unionized labor markets, and accessible mortgage financing combined to allow a larger percentage of the population than had previously been possible to accumulate meaningful capital in the form of home equity. That equity, for millions of families, functioned as the capital threshold, the point at which net worth became large enough to alter financial behavior, reduce cognitive scarcity load, and open access to borrowing at more favorable terms. The particular mechanism was different from what exists today, but the underlying dynamic was recognizable. A threshold of accumulated capital changed what the financial system offered and what behavior it rewarded. The decades since the 1980s have seen that dynamic shift considerably. The decline of defined benefit pensions, the stagnation of median wages relative to asset prices, and the increasing complexity of financial instruments have collectively made the accumulation of a first meaningful capital threshold more difficult for a larger share of the population. The mathematical reality has not changed. Compounding still works the same way it always has, but the conditions under which individuals attempt to reach the threshold have become structurally more demanding, which helps explain why the median American household retirement savings figure remains by most measures well below what would be needed to produce meaningful passive income at standard return rates. It is worth being precise about what the $100,000 figure represents, because it is easy to misread the argument being made here. The claim is not that $100,000 is enough. It is not, by most reasonable measures of financial security. The claim is not that reaching it guarantees a different financial future. It does not, because capital can be lost, spent, or mismanaged at any level. And the claim is certainly not that the number itself has magical properties. What the threshold represents is the point at which several things begin to converge. The absolute dollar returns from investment become large enough to be functionally meaningful. The cognitive conditions associated with severe financial scarcity begin to ease, and the range of options available within the financial system begins incrementally to expand. These changes do not happen all at once, and they do not happen identically for every person in every context. Cost of living, income stability, and individual circumstances all shape the actual experience of crossing this threshold. But the convergence of these three factors, mathematical, psychological, and structural, is what gives the number its recurring significance in serious financial literature and research. The deeper insight, perhaps, is that wealth accumulation is not primarily a linear process. It does not simply reward effort proportionally and continuously in a smooth upward curve. It rewards the crossing of thresholds, points at which the system itself begins to behave differently toward the capital and toward the person holding it. Understanding that dynamic does not make accumulation easier, but it does make the process more legible. And there is value in understanding the terrain clearly, even when the terrain is difficult. The relationship between people and money is shaped not only by individual behavior and individual choice, but by the mathematical properties of capital itself, by the psychological conditions that different levels of financial resource create, and by the structural architecture of the financial system that people are navigating. Recognizing that these three forces exist and that they interact differently at different capital levels is not a reason for discouragement, and it is not a reason for false optimism. It is simply a more accurate picture of how the system actually works.
$100,000 changes how money works, not because of anything inherent to the number, but because it sits near the intersection of these three dynamics, close enough to the point where returns begin to compound meaningfully, where cognitive bandwidth begins to recover, and where systemic access begins to expand. Understanding that intersection is, in itself, a form of financial literacy that most formal education never provides, and that understanding, applied patiently and consistently over time, is the foundation upon which more durable financial decisions tend to be built.